we are very happy to welcome back Anthony Antes, Master Gardener and two-time past president of the Binghamton Garden Club. Tony is currently the coordinator between the garden clubs and Master Gardener programs in the 7-state Central Atlantic region of state garden clubs, which the Oceanside Garden Club is part of. We belong to this. And again, Tony, we love your presentations and we are so happy to have you back again.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Okay, thank you. All right. You on?
I can't. Someone needs to allow me to share screen.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right. And you should be good to go now, Tony. There you go.
Okay, you should be seeing my cover page for unusual perennials that you should consider growing.
We can't see it, or maybe it's just me. Hold on one second. Sorry.
It's okay.
I seem to be having a slight difficulty.
Green is covered with a message.
Yeah, try it again, Tony.
Okay. Let me shut that down and bring it up again.
Yeah.
There's something covering the screen.
Something covering the screen? I'm not seeing anything at all on mine.
You know, I don't see it as something I can share. Somehow it's not coming up on my screen to share.
And my screen says this meeting is being recorded. Please read the following statement thoroughly, and then.
Yeah, and then you should be able to press OK, and it should go away. Let me, instead of making you a co-host, I'll make you a host, so that it shouldn't affect it. Ah, there we go. Okay, something's coming up.
Got it now?
Almost. Yes. Ooh, yes.
Although I've done a lot of these, it's still kind of magic. So now I hope you're seeing my cover slide, unusual perennials to consider growing. I'm going to go through some here. What I'll tell you up front is virtually all of them will grow in our area. My area is zone 5B. I suspect you're probably 6 or 6B because you're a little bit warmer in your location than we are. So virtually all of them are going to grow in your area if you decide you want to grow some of them. So let's get started right away. So here's the first one. It's called Acanthus spinosissima. Common name is bear's breeches. It's hardy in zones 6 through 9. Grows to a height of about 2 feet with a spread of about 20 inches. It prefers full sun to part shade. It tends to bloom in the late spring and well into the summer. The soil it wants is just an average garden soil and average moisture with good drainage. I grow it in my garden. I grow it on the south side of my house, so it gets a lot of extra sun because of that. I've had it in my yard, I suspect, for maybe 20 years. It comes back every year. There will be maybe 1 year out of 4 or 5 when it might not bloom because the conditions just weren't good enough for that, but it certainly never dies, and it just keeps coming back. And that's something you want to keep in mind with this if you decide to plant it, because it has a really large taproot, much like if you would a dandelion on steroids. So you want to decide to plant this in your garden in a place where you don't want to change it. If you decide later on you want to dig this up and get rid of it, chances are if you dig down fairly deeply, let's say 12 or 15 inches and dig it up, you probably didn't get anywhere close to the bottom of the taproot. So it's probably going to come back in a year or two. So like I said, you want to make sure you really want this where you plant it. It dates back to the Roman times in the Mediterranean. The Romans actually boiled the roots for poultices to cure burns and sprains. And supposedly it even cured baldness, but I sort of have my doubt about that. It survived in monastery gardens in England after the Roman retreat and is listed by Alexander Neckham in circa 1190, who was the abbot of Cirencester and the foster brother of Richard the Lionheart. So it's known pretty well throughout history. There are two basic species that have produced natural hybrids, one of which is the one I'm talking about here. They bloom from June onwards. They can cope with very low temperatures as long as their tap roots are established and drainage is good. So if you're just planting it for the first year, you probably want to mulch it that first year, that first winter. But after that, once it's well established, it'll be there. It's best propagated by cuttings. So you would take some cuttings in late autumn or early winter. You can also do it with sections of the root laid in a seed tray of compost. It doesn't do very well propagating it by seeds, but you could certainly try this. In the wild, they tend to actually throw their seeds 15 or 20 feet away from the host plant. So they tend to spread well in their natural habitat, but that's not going to happen here. We don't have it nearly warm enough to do that. Next one is Actinidia arguta Issei, which is a hardy kiwi. This is one I only learned about a year and a half or 2 years ago. I was really surprised to find that there was a kiwi that we can grow in our area. It's hardy all the way down to zone 4, which goes well up into Canada. It tends to grow, if it's given the right conditions, as much as 20 to 25 feet in height, or a spread of 8 to 10 feet if you grow it along a wall or a fence or something like that. It wants full sun. It blooms late June into early September, wants a normal, well-drained soil and average moisture. You'll notice from the picture in the bottom left that the hardy kiwi is the one in the foreground, the small one. The one in the background is the one you would buy in a grocery store. And of course, if you're the sort who likes to eat kiwi, you know the first thing you have to do is peel that fuzzy coating off it. But with the smaller kiwi, because it has a nice, smooth, and very thin skin, you can eat the entire fruit. So you don't have to worry about peeling it or anything. It's very fast growing. It's very hardy. What you must do if you're going to have it fruit is you must have a male and a female vine. I did some research online. These are not inexpensive, but that's because when you buy it, you actually buy a male plant that's known to produce pollen, and you buy a female plant that is known to be both well pollinated by that male plant and also is known to produce a good amount of fruit. So a pair of them will run you something on the order of $90 to $150 if you want to grow them. But it's really something of interest. The only reason I currently don't grow it is I don't really have a good place to grow a plant that large. It is the kind of vine that adheres to the wall through its cling fast, what we think of as a cling fast, sort of like English ivy would do, or maybe Virginia creeper. In other words, it does not use tendrils. It attaches itself quite well directly to the wall. Placement is very important because it will tolerate partial shade, but if you want to get a lot of fruit, you want to put it in somewhere where it's going to get a lot of sunlight. Next one is Alstromeria, or the Peruvian lily, sometimes known as Glory of the Andes. It's hardy in zone 6 through 11. So in my area, I would have to find a sort of a microclimate where it was a little bit warmer. I would probably want to plant this close to the front of my house facing south. I don't happen to grow them, by the way. They get 2 to 3 feet tall. The spread will vary depending on which particular cultivar you get. They bloom from late June into early September. And as I've mentioned with most of the plants so far, they want a normal, well-drained soil with average moisture. They come originally from Brazil and central Chile. And as you can imagine, they are the kind of thing that has a bulb for the root. And so they are going to be the kind of thing that you can reasonably divide on a regular basis. If you do that, you want to make sure you save only the very best of the bulbs to replant. In a pot, they can quickly get too big and either break the pot or come right out of the top, because generally when we plant them in pots, we plant them relatively close together, and because they are fairly prolific, they tend to expand pretty rapidly. In my area, if I walked into a Wegmans grocery store right now, I guarantee you I can buy 4, 5, 6 different colors of these as cut flowers. Wegmans has them virtually every day of the week, every day of the year, because not only are they beautiful and have multiple colors, but also they last a long time as a cut flower. It wouldn't be unusual if you regularly change the water for them to last perhaps 2 weeks as a cut flower. But the most fascinating thing about these, as far as I am concerned, is that the leaves have what is called resupinate, R-E-S-U-P-I-N-A-T-E, resupinate, in that if you were to put your finger on the top of the leaf, let's say out near the point, and you run your finger back toward the stem of the plant, just before it reaches the stem of the plant, it does a 180. So what you're actually looking at that you think is the top of the leaf is in fact the bottom of the leaf. I have no idea why that is done. I did a lot of research online and couldn't find anything about it. But I happened to give this same presentation this morning to another group, and one of the people on there said, "Oh, you need to talk with Dr. So-and-so at Cornell because he specializes in Alstromeria." So I'm going to shoot out an email to him tomorrow or the day after and see if he will respond and let me know what will cause a plant to do this. Why is this beneficial to this one particular plant to roll its leaves over like that? But it's really fascinating. Are there any questions to this point?
Hi, so John had joined a little bit late. He said he's in Brooklyn and just said, is anything applicable? You mentioned zones. So could you just clarify very briefly where we are and where you are?
I believe in your area, you're probably in USDA zone 6. And if they break your zones down like they do in my area, you may be 6A or 6B, probably 6B, because I think you're significantly warmer than we are. Here in Binghamton, we're zone 5B. By the way, back
here on Long Island, I believe 7B is in boy.
Say again?
I believe on Long Island, we are 7B as in boy.
Wow, if you're 7B, yeah, much, much warmer than we are, yeah. And by the way, back in 2011, when they redid these USDA zones, we moved from 5A to 5B. In other words, basically 5 degrees warmer. Does that answer your question about the zones?
Yeah. And John, who had the question, said that he looked it up also, and it was 7B, as JF mentioned. We also have another question. I'm not sure exactly what you were talking about at that moment. It says, I heard it can become invasive. I'm not sure what the it is. Perhaps the kiwi, because it says fruit is sold at Dag Hammarskjöld in early fall from upstate New York, if I said that right, sorry.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
That's all we have.
As to anything becoming invasive, I don't think any of the ones I just mentioned are invasive. I did mention that the bear's breeches will be hard to get rid of. but it's not invasive in that it would spread or anything like that. The Hearty Kiwi, simply because it's large, takes up a lot of space, but once again, I don't think it's considered to be invasive at all. Alstromeria will spread well, but it spreads like things like daffodils or crocus or any of those other bulb or tuber type plants do. And once again, they're readily controllable. You can dig them up easily enough and divide them up and, give some to your friends and neighbors. Any other questions?
No, she just clarified and said that, yes, Hearty Kiwi fruit sold at farmer's market. Okay. And John says, I stay away from perennials because they don't seem color-wise as vibrant as annuals, too pastel-like. And do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's true of some perennials, just like it's true of some annuals. But I'm a great supporter in people who use annuals if that's what they wish. The way that I tend to want to use annuals, let's suppose you're putting in a brand new perennial bed. And when you do, you dig up the whole area and you add compost to it, you get it all ready, and then you go out and you buy these perennials you want. And you find a perennial, take any kind of perennial, it doesn't matter. On the label, it will say something like grows to 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. But when you put it in the ground, you took it out of a 4-inch pot and planted it, and it's certainly kind of small looking. You must keep in mind that if it's going to get 3 feet wide, you shouldn't plant anything closer than 18 inches to that plant. But that's not what we like as gardeners. As gardeners, we want instant gratification. We want a beautiful garden that first year we plant it. So that's where I think annuals come in if you're a perennial gardener. Put in your perennials, follow the instructions, because you know that in 2 years or 3 years, whenever it matures, it's going to be 4 feet tall and it's going to be 3 feet wide. But in between, plant it with annuals. You'll get all the beautiful colors that you want, and you will be a much happier gardener in a couple or 3 years when your perennials have matured. But yeah, I'm certainly not against annuals.
One note on Astromeria. It is sold at Farmer Joel's and it's available during virtually the whole year. And it's a great and inexpensive bouquet that is just marvelous to have in the house.
So you probably signed in a little later than I was talking about Alstromeria, John, is that right?
Yes.
So I'll add in one other thing. Alstromerias have a unique trait in that if you were to put your finger on top of an Alstromeria leaf and follow it back to where it connects to the stem, just before it reaches the stem, the leaf does a 180-degree flip. So what you're actually looking at when you're looking at an Alstromeria leaf, you're actually looking at the bottom of the leaf. The bottom of the leaf is upright on the top when you look at it.
Yeah,
I get mine at Trader Joe's. They're on my dining room table right now.
Yeah. Once again,
yeah.
almost anybody who sells these as cut flowers, they have them 365 days a year.
Yeah, I have another one in the comments saying, yeah, you can get them at Trader Joe's and they, like you said before, they last, 2 weeks plus. They're a great hardy cut flower. It looks like that's all we have so far.
Okay, we'll move on then. Next one is called Angelica Archangelica. It's a fairly large plant, and I must admit that it's really not a true perennial. It's actually a biennial. It's hardy in zones 4 through 8, grows to a height of about 6 feet with a spread of about 2 feet. So it's a relatively tall, upright type of plant. It's one that likes to live in the shade. So if you have a shady area where you might be able to grow something this large, you might want to consider this. Bloom time is in July. The soil it wants is just normal average garden soil, but it prefers it to be slightly damp. And the reason for that is because it's growing in the shade, most shady areas tend to be more moist than sunny areas because obviously the sun doesn't evaporate the moisture as well if it can't reach the soil. So during the first year, it'll only grow leaves. And then during the second year, the stem can reach, like I said, a height of about 6 feet. The flowers are small and numerous, and as you can see them, they look a little bit like, what am I trying to think of that grows along the roadside? The flowers are in clusters, much like Queen Anne's lace. Now, they're much, much larger than Queen Anne's lace, but the layout is quite similar in that respect. They like deep, moist, loamy soil. They can actually withstand adverse environment conditions quite well, and even a severe winter frost doesn't harm them. Seedlings will even successfully develop and flower underneath trees, and that shelter creates an area of summer dryness in the surface soil, but once again, you should water them well if that's true. They've been cultivated as a vegetable and a medicinal plant for hundreds of years. They achieved great popularity in Scandinavia in the 12th century, where they're still grown today. You can make a flute-like instrument from their hollow stem, and they are often used as a flavoring agent in things like chartreuse, Benedictine, vermouth, and Dubonnet. You can also use them as flavoring in omelets, and they can be made into a jam. It's unique among its family, which is the Umbrellaceae family, for its very strong aromatic odor that smells entirely different from fennel, parsley, or anise, which are in the same group. And some people liken the scent to that of juniper. Even the roots themselves are fragrant and form one of the principal aromatics of European growth. All the parts of the plants have the same flavor, but usually they're considered to be more perishable as far as maintaining their fragrance than the root is. And you can see here in the picture, the one in the bottom center is what I think of as the species, the natural color. Top left is a bright red, almost maroon colored Angelica, which is an offshoot cultivar. Next is Astrantia major, also known as Masterwort. It's hardy in zones 5 through 9, grows to a height of about 2 feet or a little bit taller, with about a 20-inch spread. It prefers full sun to part shade. It blooms in late spring to early summer. It wants a well-drained soil with average moisture. The name Astrantia comes from the Latin for astra or star, based on its star-shaped, which is similar, by the way, to the names for asters as well, which have the same sort of star-like shape. The one you see on the right-hand side, the white one with the pink center, is the one that is what I call the species. In other words, that's the natural variety. And then the other two are cultivars of that, Moulin Rouge and Abbey Road. This is another flower that lasts well in bouquets. And by the way, they can be easily dried for winter to go in your fall and winter arrangements. If they are cut at the right time and dried, they tend to retain most of their color, whereas many flowers will go kind of brown when they've been dried, but these will retain a good bit of their color for a long while. They don't like drought, so they need some moisture. Bees and butterflies are very fond of them. You want to deadhead them because that enhances reblooming. And as you're probably well aware, the reason for deadheading is to stimulate more blooms, because the natural process for a plant is to reproduce itself. So we start with a seed that gets a seedling that becomes a plant. Eventually it has a bud, the bud opens up, and if the bud is fortunate and gets pollinated, then it will produce seed. And at that point, the plant tends to relax its growing. It's not all that interested in doing much more. So what we do by deadheading is we remove that bloom before it has a chance to set seed. By interrupting the natural life cycle of the plant then says, oh, I don't have any blooms, so I can't have any seeds, so it will produce new blooms. And so that's why we deadhead. Not just this, of course, but virtually all the plants that we deadhead, we do it for that reason. It's highly regarded by floral designers for the looks. Like I said, it will act both as a cut flower fresh and also dried for winter arrangements. You can easily divide it in the springtime, and also by deadheading it, you don't want to leave the head on there, because if the seeds do get pollinated, and they drop into your garden, you're going to have a lot of these, because they can be quite prolific as far as growing from seeds naturally. Next one is Bellam Kinensis, or at least that's what it used to be called. This is a native to Central Asia. It reproduces by rhizomes. It's also called the Blackberry Lily. It's hardy in zones 5 through 10, grows to about 3 feet tall and a spread of about 2 feet. It wants full sun. It blooms mid to late summer. It wants normal soil and average moisture. It was originally known as Bellam Kinensis, but by studying the DNA of the plant, they discovered that actually it belonged in the iris family, and so it was renamed Iris domestica. So that's its correct name. If you were going to look it up today as its Latin taxonomic name, you would look for Iris domestica. It's obviously called Blackberry Lily due to the seed pods that you see in that right-hand middle picture. They're certainly not edible in that regard. So once again, as the bloom dies, the seed head forms, and you get those blackberry-like seed pods. They are, like I said, want full to partial sun, moist to dry conditions. The flowers are rarely bothered by disease or insect pests. Medicinally, the dried rhizome has long been used in East Asia to treat throat troubles, asthma, swollen liver, gonorrhea, malaria, and arrow poisoning. And it is currently under studies to investigate its apparent potential against prostate cancer. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. Are there any questions to this point?
Nothing right now.
Okay. Next one are Keraxes. Keraxes are in the Cyperaceae family, also known as sedges. They are a relatively low-growing, grass-like, but not a true grass, plant. They are hardy in zones 5 through 9, and there are many, many varieties of them. Height varies, but relatively few get above maybe 12 to 14 inches tall, and that would be probably just the bloom head itself. They tend to spread, but at a reasonable rate, because being a small plant, they're easily controllable. They want partial to full shade, so these are a great one to put in a border next to a garden where you might have hostas or bleeding heart, dicentras, something like that. So they make a good border for a place like that. Blooms are insignificant, as I say, but that's true of most of these types of plants. Plants like this were never pollinated by bees or butterflies or moths or insects or anything. They are wind pollinated. So through the millions of years of their growth, they never developed flowers to lure pollinators, since they weren't pollinated in that way. They're often found in wetlands such as marshes, fens, and bogs. There are numerous, as I said, numerous varieties. I just show 4 of them here. Top left is Gold Fountains, which is basically green and yellow streaked, very narrow bladed. Bottom one tends to get that beautiful rusty color. Top right is Ice Dance, which is much like Gold Fountains, except it's white and green instead of yellow and green. And the bottom one, Banana Boat, has a much, much wider leaf than the others. Banana Boat, by the way, there are some other varieties of it that are simply different colored. Some that go almost orange and green. So you can find a lot of varieties of cultivars of the Keraxes. What tends to separate them easily from what you and I know as grasses, if you were to take the stem of a grass and roll it between your fingers, you could feel that the grass stem is cylindrical. It just feels like it's round, okay, it's basically round. If you did the same with the sedges, you would find that the stem is triangular in cross section. So as you roll it between your fingers, you can feel each of the edges as it rolls. And that has led to a common term that we use for sedges, in that we say sedges have edges. So that's just one way of telling them away from grasses. Next is Krakozmia, also known as Montbrisia. Quite often that name is used over in England. They are based on corms, as you see in the bottom left picture. Hardy in zones 5 through 9. They tend to grow 2 to 4 feet tall, depending on the variety. They want full sun to part shade. They tend to bloom all summer, once again, if you deadhead them on a regular basis. Normal soil and average moisture. Most people who are familiar with Krakozmia are familiar with the one called Lucifer because of its brilliant red color. And like most flowers that bloom with multiple blooms on a single stem, the blooms on the bottom of the stem open first, and then they gradually open up, coming up the stem as the ones down below tend to fade. They look best grown in groups. I do grow some at my house, but I don't have but 3 or 4 of them. Every so often, I think I'm going to grow some more, but I just never get around to it. They grow well in containers as well, so it makes it much easier to take care of that way. You can then bring, of course, the whole container in to protect it from the freeze, because as you're well aware, container-grown plants, the side walls of the containers are exposed to much harsher winter conditions than a plant that's planted in the soil. But you could also dig them up and put them away for the winter, much like we do with cannas or calla lilies, things like that. So you could do that as well. They're propagated easily by dividing that bulb corm. So you can see there's a lot of bulbs together in that one plant in the bottom left-hand side. And once you do that, divide them up, keep only the very best ones. And if you're going to do that for best plant growth, you should do that about every 3 or 4 years. Next one is Echinacea. Now, most people say, oh, Echinacea, that's purple coneflower. That's certainly not an unusual perennial. But the reason I added here is, first of all, it's a very strong growing perennial, and the varieties, the cultivars from it are just almost innumerable. They typically bloom in the summer. They're hardy in zones 3 through 9, so they're hardy basically from well up in Canada all the way down to Florida. They grew 2 to 4 feet tall, once again, depending on the variety. The spread is anywhere from 2 to 3 feet. They want full sun to part shade. They bloom late spring and well into the summer, average soil and average moisture. They tend to grow in clumps, and they will spread that way as well. As with most plants, if you were to harvest the seeds from the Echinacea and plant them, you are probably going to get, as a result, a basic purple coneflower. Because most cultivars, you will not get the color to come true from the seed. So if you wanted to divide them up, the best way to do that is divide the root ball, which you can do quite easily just by digging it up and dividing it. But the other thing you can also do is you can take cuttings from it. If the cutting has a bloom, you want to get rid of the bloom immediately because you don't want to put any of its energy into the bloom. You want the energy to go into the developing of the roots. In the garden, they're great in a full sun border. In a kitchen or an herb garden, they produce a lot of beauty as well. And of course, as you're probably aware, Echinacea is used as an immune boosting supplement against colds, flus, and minor infection. So the University of Connecticut in 2007 combined the findings from 14 different trials that examined Echinacea, and they concluded from averaging out those 14 trials that Echinacea can cut the chances of catching a cold by 1/2, and it will shorten the duration of a cold by as much as 1.4 days. If you do choose to leave them to go to seed, you will probably find that goldfinches love the seeds. So it can be really interesting to see a little goldfinch hanging on a stem, bobbing about in the breeze while it's picking out those seeds to eat. And once again, the flowers are great for flower arrangements too. Are there any questions to this point?
Yes, JF asks, what is meant by true sedges?
Oh, they're true sedges in that there are other plants that look much like sedges but are not. So that's why the telltale is to take that stem and roll it between your fingers and feel those edges. Feel the fact that it's triangular in cross section. There's other plants. For example, some people tend to think of cat nine tails as being sedges, which of course they're not. They're in a family all of their own. But there are also smaller grasses that tend to grow low like sedges do. But once again, they're true grasses. Their stems would have the cylindrical shaped stem. So I call it true sedges in that they are the only ones in the family called Cyperaceae, which is the family for sedges. Any other questions?
Yes, on Echinacea, what part would you use to make tea or such for health benefits?
Wow, I don't think I would ever do that with my own. I think I would go out and buy that so that I knew it was properly organically grown and so forth. I never thought of actually doing it myself. I'm gonna jot that down and see if I can find an answer for you. And if I do, I'll email it. By the way, I'm going to email you the handout so you can distribute that to your people who have attended.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good point about that you wouldn't take it from your own personal garden just for those reasons. But yeah, if anyone does focus their home gardening on being organic, then yeah. Interesting question.
They would be much more likely to use it from an organic garden than they would from just an average garden. I'm not an organic gardener. Sometimes I use well, in fact, every year I use deer scram, and I wouldn't want to spray that anywhere near an echinacea and then try and brew tea from it.
Yeah. We have another question that just popped up. My cone flowers never come back the next year. Do you know why?
Well, my first question would be, are they a cultivar? In other words, are they not the basic purple cone flower, but something much more exotic?
That's a good question. We'll give her a chance to answer that. Maybe we can circle back to that a little later.
Yep, I'm happy to do that because, and the reason I mentioned that as a possibility, the further and further we get from the native species of any plant, not just echinacea, but any plant, roses, hostas, you name it, the further we get from the original plant, generally speaking, the less hardy they are. Because hybridizers are usually seeking a specific goal. Take the pictures you see here. The top left and bottom left pictures, they don't look anything like a purple coneflower, and yet they are a coneflower. They are part of the Echinacea family, but they are so far away from the original plant that they tend to not be nearly as hardy. Cast your mind back to what happened to roses over the last, let's say, 75 years. Used to be roses were extremely fragrant, but they would only have 10, 12, 15 petals. People over the years said, I would really like to see my rose have lots more petals. So gradually the hybridizers hybridized them, and as they gained more and more petals, by just a part of natural selection of those cultivars, they lost most of their fragrance. That's why nowadays there's kind of a resurgence with roses. People want that fragrance again, so they're looking for heirloom roses, and they're willing to give up that abundance of petals in order to get the fragrance of the rose. Another good example are hostas. A species hosta is almost always solid green or very slightly variegated, but not much, and that will grow extremely well in a fully shaded location. It'll grow large. I have one called Princess Wu. The leaves on it will get 24 inches long and 18 inches wide. It's really a huge one. I have some miniatures where the leaves are about the size of my thumbnail, but those are hybrids from the basic green one. What we see a lot of in hostas is yellow and white streaked green, or yellow streaked green, or almost all yellow with a bit of green streaks or splotches in it. There's now a hosta you can get. It's got an ivory colored leaf, almost completely ivory colored with no trace of green whatsoever, and a bright red stem. But if you will look at the label of those hostas that are highly variegated, they no longer say plant them in the shade. They say plant them in part shade or part sun or even sun, because they've gotten so far away from what the original hosta was that they have a much different requirement than the original plant did. Generally speaking, any plant that's variegated needs more sunlight than its original green species variety did.
So on those coneflowers, she said that they are not purple. They were beautiful colors.
Yeah, and that's all I can think of that it is. You may have just had a bad year. You may have had, too much rain, not enough rain. I can't say for specifically, but once again, once you drift away from the basic purple original coneflower, they get less and less hardy. I'm not too sure, but what the growers aren't happy with that, because that way you're going to have to go out and buy a replacement for it.
And we have another question that popped up from John, which is, well, if the hybridizing plants causes these problems, so what about genetically modified food dangers? So with some question marks, which is a much more in-depth topic, I think.
Yes, it is. And I can tell you right now that a lot of us are really hesitant to get anything that's been genetically modified because many people don't know whether it's good or bad. You either trust science or you don't. You can do a lot of research and decide whether or not you consider it to be safe or not. I live alone, and I buy a lot of my meals from HelloFresh and from a new one, which is Martha Stewart and Marley Spoon. And almost every one of those will say that the vegetative material that you get in that is not GMO modified. But you really see a lot of that, those cautionary notes when it comes to seeds that you do for sprouting and for microgreens. You never ever see those that do not say that they are non-GMO. Many of them, of course, will say organic. There is a New York State standard in that. And if I was going to continue to do seed sprouting, which I do occasionally, I look only for the ones that have that New York seal of approval on them, because I know that they are raised and harvested to a very high standard. So I understand that a lot of people will not touch GMO. Hybridizing, though, hybridizing's been around for hundreds of years. And I'll bet you when they first hybridized that there were people who wouldn't touch a plant that was hybridized. If you were to see the original ear of corn, it's about as long as your middle finger. It's not much larger in diameter than that. And the seeds you would get from it are really, really tiny. So corn has been hybridized and hybridized over the year to get that wonderful sweet corn we get every year to eat. And of course, the what I think of as the pig corn that we feed to our birds and things like that. But lots and lots of foods are now hybridized, and we don't think anything about it in our generation. But I suspect 100 years ago, that was not considered anything but radical.
Cool. And Barbara chimes in with a different topic. I love coral bells. What do you think about them as perennials? I cut back the outer leaves and they grow back beautifully.
I love coral bells. And once again, there's many, many varieties of those. And if you get, once again, the original one, they tend to be rather average looking leaves, but they grow really well. But you can get coral bell, heuchera, by the way, is the other name, right? You can get those in a variety of colors, and we tend to grow them for their foliage more than their bloom. I think I have probably, I'm going to say conservative, 3 or 4 different varieties right now. I can't come up with the name of them offhand. One is a very bronzy colored leaf. Another one is a kind of a mottled purplish pink leaf. But yeah, I love them as perennials. Anything else?
That's it right now.
Okay, we'll go on. So next is what we call Aerosymum or wallflower. This is a excellent plant to have in your garden. It is hardy in zones 5 through 10, grows 1 to 2 feet tall, 20-inch spread, likes full sun to light shade. Bloom time is from late spring into the summer. Average soil and average moisture. It looks great in a rock garden. It's an old-fashioned garden flower. The problem with it, as I mentioned here, it tends to bloom itself to death. You'll notice the one top left, the yellow one, which is a particularly favored variety. They can overbloom themselves and actually die from too much blooming, which I find kind of fascinating. They will do well in poor, gritty, well-drained soil. They like full sun. They hate poorly drained soil, so you don't want them where they're going to stay moist. I don't grow them because of this next reason, and that is they do not do well in heavy clay soil. I have a lot of clay soil at my place. They grow best in a cool, moist climate, but once they're fully established, they can withstand a fair amount of drought. You can grow these from seeds. The seeds can be sown directly into the garden in midsummer or very early spring. Plant the seeds 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch deep and 8 to 10 inches apart. They can also easily be started indoors from seeds as well. They can be propagated also from softwood cuttings. So if you, once again, as I mentioned for a couple of the other ones, take a cutting, and if there's a bloom on it, immediately remove the bloom. Put the cutting into a moist growing medium. Put it somewhere where it will get indirect light. In many cases, if you want to retain the moisture best, put a plastic bag over it and snug that down. And most of them will root within a matter of a couple of 3 weeks. The yellow one is particularly a good one in that it has a mild sweet fragrance as well. And you can see there's quite a few varieties there. Next is Hibiscus Milk. It's what we think of as the hardy hibiscus. It's hardy in zones 4 through 9. So once again, well up into Canada and all the way down to Florida. Grows 3 to 8 feet tall with a spread of 2 to 3 feet. wants full sun to part shade, blooms midsummer to fall. So this is a late bloomer, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. It wants normal soil and average moisture. You get these spectacular large blooms. You can see that little girl probably has a bloom that's, I would guess, 12 or 15 inches across. The other two pictures are blooms from my garden because I have these. The pink one on the left, I've had that one probably 20 years, and it comes back every year. Having said that, they are very, very late to come up out of the garden. So if you decide to grow one of these, after when you get into the fall and you're about to cut them back, leave at least a 3 or 4 inch stem so you know right where it is, because chances are, come June, you're going to say, oh, gee, my hibiscus must have died because I don't see a thing. And then early July, and you still don't see anything. And then mid-July, at least in my area, probably your area, very late June or early July, it seems to leap up out of the ground all of a sudden and grows up to that, once again, 3 to 8 feet tall. The blooms, there are normally, I would say in my case, 4 to 6 buds on a stem. They're all fairly closely clustered together, and they tend to open sequentially, which is nice because you can deadhead one, and then the next one will open up. They don't all open at the same time. If you want a really, really large bloom, what you want to do is strip off all but one bud on a stem. I can't bring myself to do that. I would rather have multiple blooms, but smaller than a really, really large bloom, and only a few of them. For those of you who entertain guests at your house, particularly dinner guests, you know one of the no-nos is to put in a flower arrangement in the middle of your table where you can't see across to the other people. That's really an etiquette no-no. You don't want to do that. So I have found what I consider to be the absolute lowest flower arrangement to put on a table. Right in the middle of the table, I put a standard dinner plate. I pour enough water into it to get almost up to the edge. I take one large bloom like this, and I cut it off in such a way that there's maybe an inch of stem left behind the bloom, and I just float it on the water. Everybody can see over top of that arrangement. That's all there is to it, just one bloom. It looks really pretty, and the bloom will certainly last through the meal, but not much beyond that. They probably are going to want to be staked, because once those blooms start to open up, they tend to get rather top heavy. So you really need to stake them to make sure. Once again, if you were to collect the seeds from the bloom, they will not come back true, but will revert to their original species plant. If you do want to propagate them, you can either dig them up and divide them, or you can once again take soft cuttings and plant them in the spring, or you can take hardwood cuttings in the fall and plant it that way. The next one is Hydrangea Anomala. Subspecies is called Petiolaris, and it's a climbing hydrangea. That's another one that's relatively new to my repertoire here, because I had no idea there was such a thing as a climbing hydrangea. I've done this presentation to a couple other people, and some had said, oh, I know about that. I have one in my yard, but I certainly had never heard of it. They are hardy in zones 5 through 9. They can get as big as 30 to 50 feet. They want sun to part shade. They tend to bloom in May to early July. They want a rich, fertile soil, and you can imagine that's true in order for them to grow that rapidly. They are happy with low moisture, by the way. They get large flower clusters. Each cluster can be as much as 10 inches in diameter. The subspecies name is in reference to the long petioles of the plant, which is why it's called Petiolaris. You can propagate them either by seeds or by stem cuttings. They have no serious insect or disease problems. They do need a strong support because this one does not adhere as well, although it still uses the holdfasts, like I mentioned with the earlier vines. So they will attach themselves to, I always think of a brick wall as one of the ideal things to adhere to, but you could do a rough trellis with a rough wood fencing type of material. You can also grow this as a ground cover, just let it sprawl across the ground. They are a little difficult to initially get started, which is partly why I have not actually tried one of these, but I would certainly like to. Are there any questions to this point?
No questions. Carol had just said planted last year. I love them. Hope they come back. I'm not sure what that was in reference to. Oh, and Rita just says, does cutting hydrangea flower aid in following year's growth?
Say that again?
Does cutting hydrangea flower aid in the following year's growth?
Not particularly. What it aids in. So we're talking about hydrangeas in general, not just the climbing hydrangea. Okay, I got to be a little careful what I'm saying. There are two different varieties of hydrangea, group 1 and group 2. Group 1, I believe, is the one that grows on, that blooms on new growth. So group 1, you would prune it back in the fall to early winter, because it's going to bloom on the new wood that comes out in springtime. Group 2 is the opposite. Group 2 blooms on old wood. So you do the pruning for group 2 right after it's done blooming, because that way it's going to have the wood that has developed from the time you cut back the dead blooms all the way through the summer to the fall, and they are going to produce the blooms next year. So you need to know which kind of hosta, which kind of hydrangea you have. You can look that up online pretty easily, just by looking for hydrangea, and then hopefully you have a name tag for yours. If you do, certainly look it up with the name as well, because then you can find out whether it's a group 1 or group 2.
Okay, that's all right now.
Okay. This is one that most people don't think of as growing, but it will grow quite well in our area. This is the Opuntia species of prickly pear cactus. Once again, it's hardy in zones 4 through 9, so all the way up into Canada, all the way down into Florida. The height and the spread tends to vary because there are a lot of different species of this. It wants full sun to part shade, tends to bloom in late spring well into the summer, normal soil and average moisture. Looks great in rock gardens, not prone to insects or disease. As you are probably aware, that fruit that you see in the center picture is edible. The flowers tend to be either orange or yellow. And across the nation, they grow anywhere from as small as 2 inches tall to as tall as 100 feet. Now, the large ones obviously don't grow in our area. They are native from Canada through Chile and Argentina. When you're going to handle these, you obviously want to wear leather gloves. All Opuntias not only have normal spines, the kind of spines that you can see in the picture, but they also, many of them have a very thin, barbed spines that are barely visible, and they're called glockids, Glocchids. These can actually get stuck in your skin and be very irritating. Think of what would happen if you were handling spun glass. That spun glass can break up into little bits and can get into your fingers and be quite irritating. So if you're going to be working with the Opuntia cactus, assume that it has these fine hairs, these fine glockids, And so you would want to moisten your cactus all over, spray it with some water, and that reduces the likelihood that when you pick it up, these things actually may become airborne, and so they can easily affect you. One of the women who was in the presentation I did this morning said now she understands why she can feel little prickly things on her hands, even though she never actually touched her cactus, because it was probably these fine hair-like barbs called glochids getting on her hands. They have very colorful flowers. They typically grow with a flat rounded, what we call platyclades. The juicy stems can be globular in shape, cylindrical, branch, trailing, even vine-like. Only 2 of the many species actually have true leaves. The other 2,000 are without any leaves. Prickly pears can produce a fruit that is commonly eaten in Mexico, and they can also use it to make a drink called agua fresca, which is Spanish for fresh or cold waters. You can actually make a jam from them as well. But I suspect most people will not grow these simply because of the hazard. Certainly wouldn't want to grow them if I had a pet that was running outdoors on a regular basis. By the way, I did grow them for 2 or 3 years, and believe it or not, what actually happened to them was the deer ate them, which I found kind of surprising. Next one is called Fissottigia virginiana, and as you can tell by the name, Virginiana, it was first originally named in the state of Virginia. They tend to grow hardily in zones 3 through 9. They get 2 to 4 feet tall. They like full sun to part shade. They prefer their soil to be slightly acidic. Average moisture is fine, and they bloom late summer into early fall. As you can tell, looking at the blooms in the picture, they bloom much like foxgloves do. They're very much shaped like a foxglove, and as you can see, the blooms open from the bottom and work their way up the stem. They get quite a few blooms. The flower stems are usually unbranched. In other words, it's a single stem with a group of flowers on that single stem. Eventually, they will ripen in the fall into brown, dull-surfaced seed pods. They're native to eastern North America, so this is a native plant to our area. From Quebec and Manitoba down to Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. Excuse me. They tend to favor moist areas like banks, ditches, seepages, woodland bogs, and pine savannas. As I said, they like a slightly acidic soil. They are happy either in sunny or slightly shaded spots, but does well with some shade on the drier sites. Propagation is quite easily done. You can sow seeds outdoors in the spring or summer, up to 2 months before the first frost. So you can sow them before the first frost, or indoors anytime. For best germination rates, it's best to do them indoors. Sow them. Seedlings will tend to appear within a few weeks. Use a rich loamy soil mix. Keep it moist and around 70 to 75 degrees. Seedlings will flower in their second year. So if you're going to do them on your own, don't expect blooms that first year. If you're going to divide them, the best time to divide them, as is true of most plants, is in the early spring. But in the mild climates, you can also divide them in early fall, which you probably could in your area. Then you want to protect the new plants with mulch. They are great. They look great in a wildflower meadow or water garden edges. The blooms are very long lasting as cut flowers. And as their name implies, obedient plant. If you're a floral arranger, you know that if you stick the stem of a bloom into your oasis, And when you turn it loose, it's maybe not pointing in the direction you want it to. So with most blooms, what you would do is you would pull it out of the oasis and plug it back in a little bit different until you were happy with it. And if that happened a lot, you wind up with poking a lot of unnecessary holes in your oasis. But if you are using the obedient plant and it's only slightly out of alignment with what you want, you simply put your finger against the bloom stem, hold it to where you want it, hold it there for a minute or two, and when you turn it loose, it's going to stay there, which I think is really fascinating. So you can push them to a different direction and they'll stay in that new position. And once again, that's how the plant got its name. It looks great to provide late season color. They're in many varieties of color. The pink one that you see there is the natural color. The white one is a cultivar called Summer Snow. It holds its own very well. It's considered to be deer resistant, so it should do well in a place where deer might otherwise eat the buds off before the flowers can even open. This completes my presentation. Are there any questions at this point?
Yes. Rhizomes, are they poisonous like foxgloves to cats?
Rhizomes for which plant? Are you talking about one I just talked about?
It doesn't.
Or just rhizomes in general? Because I can't really answer that question very well. There certainly are rhizomes that would be poisonous. I can't off the top of my head think of one that is, but once again, if it's properly planted, most rhizomes are planted under the soil, so that shouldn't be a problem. What I'm thinking of iris, we tend to plant them with their corms sticking up partly out of the soil because otherwise they will tend to rot. So that might be a concern, but I have them at my house and I've never had any concern with animals. Now, the cat I have is not an outdoor cat, so that would not be a problem for me. But I don't know offhand of one that I would think of as being particularly poisonous. If you have a specific plant, look up that plant and see if its rhizome is poisonous, but off the top of my head, I honestly can't answer that.
Okay, thanks, Tony. That's all right now.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, I want to thank you all. I have here on a phone number that you could call in our area, but I'm sure you probably have something similar to this in your area. This is part of our Cornell Cooperative Extension. You would have a cooperative extension there in your county. Contact them if you have any questions relative to your plants in general. For example, here in our area, from April the 15th to October the 15th, every Thursday from 9 to noon, we have somebody who sits at a desk where they have a computer and they have a telephone, and people either call in or email in and ask questions. It's much nicer now that we use the computer, because it used to be we would get a phone call from someone who would say, I have this plant, it's green and it's got a bug on it, and can you tell me what's wrong? And of course, we couldn't. We didn't have enough information. Nowadays, they can get out their smartphone, they can make a picture of it, they can email us a picture of the plant and the bug, and we can easily look it up and give them an answer probably while they wait. So that's really one of the big benefits we've gotten to computerizing our responses to this. I suspect it's probably that way in your area as well. They're a great resource, and of course, that's why I do these presentations. This is part of my requirement to remain active as a master gardener. So as I said, this completes my presentation. Like I said, I can entertain any other questions if you have them, but if not, I'd thank you for your attention and thank you for inviting me. And I always do enjoy doing presentations.
Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you. And we do have a Nassau County Cooperative Extension. I'm not sure of their hours exactly, but it's easy enough for anybody to look it up.
Sure.
So, but thank you so much. We really appreciate, once again, your knowledge and your information is invaluable. Thank you again.
You're quite welcome.
Yep, nothing in the chat, just thank you very much.